that you are aware of, but I remember when we had our first child, I thought my obligation was to be sure not to raise another Lee Harvey Oswald. And then all of a sudden, we had those 4 children in New Zealand. 3 of them were born in New Zealand, and all of a sudden, we start having these grandchildren. And the responsibility really, really changes, doesn't it? They are really grandchildren. And Judy and I have been blessed to have 13 grandchildren, and that's a real great blessing. And when our first great-grandchild was about to be born, I thought, well, that'll be like number 14. I don't know if you're on that page or not, but you got this level of children, and then you've got this grandchildren. And you know what that's all about? It's to make sure they have at least one trip to Disney, and every time they ask, take me to McDonald's, you take them. I mean, that's about the end of your responsibility. You've raised kids, it's their responsibility to take care of all of that, and I don't mean that literally when I say that, but the whole picture changes. And then all of a sudden, there's another level called great-grandchildren. And great-grandchildren are really great. Now, in that sense, I do have great-great-grandchildren. That first grade is not a generational word. It's just a descriptive word, if you understand what I'm talking about. And it's just good to be here. To talk about this, you need to understand what New Testament Christianity was all about. In Jeremiah chapter 31, the Lord says, that it's going to come to pass that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel, with the house of Judah. Not according to the covenant, this is verse 31, when I took them by the hand and led them out of the land of Egypt. This was the covenant that they broke. But then he says, when that new covenant comes, their sins will I remember no more. And then there's an interesting part of that sort of jumps out at you when you first read it. They shall not teach every man his neighbor, and every man his brother, saying, know the Lord. For they all shall know me, from the least unto the greatest. That's interesting. We come to New Testament Christianity, and what is it? It's evangelism. We know the Great Commission. You know 2 of the places the Great Commission is given. Go preach the gospel to every creature. That's Mark 16:15. Matthew 28:19 says, go make disciples of all nations. And the whole message in the New Testament is go teach your neighbor, go teach your neighbor, go teach your neighbor. And yet, here is a prophecy in the Old Testament that says when the New Testament comes, they shall not teach every man his neighbor, or every man his brother, saying, know the Lord. That looks like, at first, it's a contradiction. They shall not, and then go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. When you first look at that, that's different. But there is a very distinct difference that we need to make between that Old Testament and New Testament. How did one, under the Old Testament system, come into a covenant relationship with God and in that sense become a child of God? Under Judaism, how did it happen? The very day that child was born, he was a child of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He was a part of the kingdom of Israel. They were God's chosen people. And so here he was, from the very day that he was born, he is a part of God's chosen people. Question: how much does he know about God? I want you to think about that. When he's 5 years of age, how much does he know about God? When he's 25 years of age, what knowledge does he have of God And where would it have come from? Isn't that amazing? Under the Old Testament, that individual became a part of God's chosen people, did not know that God created the world, did not know, about Mount Sinai necessarily, did not know about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and yet all of a sudden, he's in this world. And if we can just stop long enough, we need to understand that's close to where many of the children in America are. They're born in America. They know some things about God. They know the word Christian. They know John 3:16. They know a little bit about this, and their knowledge is about like that. And the world into which we go preach the gospel is made up of people that are people like that. They know so very little about that. But go back to that Old Testament system. How on earth is God, what was God's plan to cause those people to know about God? Well, you know this verse. You may not know it's in Deuteronomy chapter 6, but starting in verse 4, that said, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one God." I want you to hear that. We read the Bible so fast, we read that and we just keep reading. Okay, I know that. Yes, but if you'd grown up in a world where there were many gods, and that's the world that those Jewish individuals were growing up in. They were in a pagan world, and they had the god of harvest. They had a sun day. They had a moon day. They had a Thor's day. They had a Saturn day. Isn't that amazing? The world that they grew in was a world that was pagan, and obviously not at Mount Sinai did they know the days of the week. But that's the world they grew up in. The only gods they knew. You know the danger of having more than one God? Which one are you going to love the most? If you're an only child, you are really blessed because mom and daddy don't have any choice. You know, they've got you, they're stuck with you and everything. And so you're the whole focus. But if there are 3 or 4 or 5 children, you have to pick the child. Well, it's his birthday, we're going to do something for this one. And the other 3 children said, you didn't do that for my birthday. You know what I'm talking about, that kind of situation. You can recognize how that comes up. Now, what about the gods? I remember when I was in India, and I spent 2.5 months in India working with some of the preachers there on one occasion. And I asked my translators, how many gods are there in India? How many idols? And I was shocked. How many words are there in the English language? You got a dictionary. How many words does it have? You remember in school years ago, you had that big, thick dictionary that had 200,000 words in it, about that many. What Merriam-Webster's has 50,000 words or some such number. How many gods do you have? And he didn't know how to express it in English because he didn't know English numbers to express it. But he said, let me write it down. And I've asked another Indian this same question. They've gotten this same answer, 32 million gods. There must be a proverb that says that, because how on earth, would you tell me the names of 32 million gods? You know, I mean, we've got 13 grandchildren and we've got 19 great-grandchildren, and how do you remember the names of 19 great-grandchildren? You stop and think about it. I've told my granddaughters, I said, look, I don't care what you name them, give them a number. I can remember numbers. And but how would you remember your gods? And you wouldn't. Hear, O Israel, Jehovah is one God. And then what does it say? And thou shalt love the Lord thy God. You know that verse, don't you? You know how Jesus described the rest of that verse? In your mind, could you stumble around and just about quote that verse? Love the Lord thy God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength. You know what Jesus says? That's the greatest commandment God gave. Isn't that remarkable? It begins, see, that's in Deuteronomy 6. You know what's in Deuteronomy chapter 5? Well, why is Deuteronomy named Deuteronomy? If you look at it, and I know this is not proper in English, but it has this name. You know what a duet is, don't you? It's two. The word for law is nomos. Duet nomos. Deuteronomos is the name of that book. Why does it have that name? Because the Ten Commandments were first given in Exodus chapter 20. But when that generation dies out there in the wilderness, Moses calls all the Jews again, and he delivers them the Ten Commandments again, and that's in Deuteronomy chapter 5. Now, you can ignore chapter divisions. Sometimes they get in our way. He had just given them the Ten Commandments, and he said, and the words that I command you this day shall be in your heart. Isn't that amazing? And you shall teach them diligently unto your children. Wait a minute. Under Judaism, a person did not even know about God. In fact, you may not be aware of this, but one of the reasons that the Jews had problems is because in rearing their children is because they did not do what the Lord said. When they went into the promised land under Joshua and they were take out all those Canaanite nations, Moses said, you destroy everything in there. You don't leave anything. You take the cities and you tear down their idols, and then amazingly says, don't even mention their name. If you don't have a name of something, it's a thingamajig. It's a what is it? It's a whatchamacallit. And had they done that, that's not what they did. And so when they got into the land, the pagan word for Lord is Baal. B-A-A-L. I grew up as a Jewish individual. I'm in the days of Joshua or during the period of the Judges, and I hear about the word Baal. You know what it means? It means Lord. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one God. Now that word Lord there is not the word Baal. It's the other Hebrew word for Lord. But you need to understand the fact that if you're growing up in that culture, and that's the place where they used to worship Baal. You see that broken idols? That's where they worship Baal. This is Baal. Baal's here. They used to have idols here for Baal, 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 Baal. And every time you hear the word Baal, guess what you think of? You never think of Jehovah thy God as one God. You think he's Baal. Thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children. And the words that I command thee this day shall be in your heart. And that's where it all begins. It is remarkable to read the rest of the historical study about that was God's plan under the Old Testament. You see, under the Old Testament, they not only had to teach every man his neighbor and every man his brother about Jehovah God, they even had to teach their children. Otherwise, every time they heard the word Baal, they wouldn't think of Jehovah at all. They'd think of those idols. Let's serve the Lord. And all of a sudden, in their mind, Baal and Lord are sort of synonymous. They have a similar meaning, and they seem to be the very same word. And so you begin talking about Baal, and they're there in the land. They did not go into the land and destroy it. they did a great job. You know how long they were faithful? You read the book of Joshua. They were faithful, Joshua chapter 2, all the days of Joshua and that generation. You know what happened? That second generation failed to teach their children the things they had learned in that first generation. Do you know how close the Lord's church is from ceasing to be? One generation. You look at the period of the Judges, and it is a mix of unbelievable proportion that is there of just them going to idols. You know the outline perhaps of the book of Judges, how that they were faithful to God as long as that generation was there, but then they turned to other gods. They turned to their Baals, they turned to Asheroth, they turned to the pagan gods that were there, and even adopted, after the time of Solomon, the worship of Milcom, where they offered their own children as animal sacrifices to a pagan god. How far can you get from God? One generation after another, after another, after another, after another, after another. If you want to understand the why of the Old Testament, that there were generations that they did not understand these things, you need to understand their failure to follow what was said when those 10 commandments were given. The words I give thee this day, those words about the 10 commandments, they're to be in your heart, and you're to teach them diligently unto your children. That's the plan. Now, if you don't do that, whose fault is it? You need to understand that same responsibility is upon parents in our day and our ages. Train up a child in the way he should go is the Old Testament verb or Old Testament description of responsibility from the book of Proverbs. What about this one? Train up a child in the way he should go. You want a New Testament verse? Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he'll not depart from it. That's New Testament. Whatever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, but we haven't done a good job learning what it says in the Old Testament about it. And thou shalt teach them diligently unto your children. Now, those of us who are past the age of having our own children, and to those who are not past that, you need to really listen to this. But those of us who are older need to understand the grandparents' responsibility in this. We'll talk about that if we have time. But you and I need to understand that when that group that came out of Egypt did not teach these things to their children, there came another generation. That first generation under Moses perished in the wilderness. 603,548 of them died out there in that wilderness because of unbelief. Those who were above 20 years of age, those who were accountable, every single one of them perished except Joshua and Caleb and perhaps some Levites. But you begin looking at some of these things, and you'll come to a realization they entered into the promised land. And the last thing Moses said, the book of Deuteronomy is written in the last month of Moses' life. Would you not like, as grandparents, to have one real long shot where you had all of your grandchildren there and you could talk to them about life and about what life is all about? That's what Moses had. He called all Israel together, the book of Deuteronomy says, and when he finishes the words of Deuteronomy, there are 3 different speeches in it. When he finishes the book of Deuteronomy, he goes up to the mountain. and he's not able himself to go over into the promised land. But that generation was faithful. Why? They had eaten manna all of their lives out there in the wilderness. That's that second generation, those adults that went in there, but they failed to do the most important thing. The words that I teach you to command you this day shall be in your heart, and you shall teach them diligently unto your children. How do you do that? You shall talk about these things. We need to learn how to read it slow. Isn't that amazing? I just don't know how to teach them. You shall talk about these things when you're sitting down. The day's over. You've been out working in the fields, you're harvesting and everything, and you come in and there is perhaps some evening meal to try to put an American situation over in that. You've had your dinner. Now, if you're as old as I am and grew up in the South, that's not really dinner, that's supper. And so you've had your dinner, and you talk to your children about these things. When you're rising up, you talk to your children about these things. How do you do that? By living and by talking to them about life. We're going to talk some more about this in the next hour. But your children and your grandchildren are forming attitudes right now toward things, and there are unwritten messages that we are always given to our children. Sometimes by what we do that negatively impacts them, but that sometimes those things which we do that are not necessarily sinful and inherently sinful within themselves, but teach them the absolute wrong values. When you're sitting down, when you're rising up, when you're on the way. Isn't that amazing? Make a modern application. Kids, we're going to go on a 10-day vacation. We're not going to go to church while we're gone. You know what Deuteronomy 6 says? When you're traveling, when you're sitting at home, you shall talk about these things. Somebody says, I'm not sure how you do that. You ever look at a bird? You ever see birds? Behold the fowls of the air. Have you ever been with your child? Is that something you could talk to your child about? Can you begin to imagine what you could talk about your children just when you did the very thing? That's a positive command, by the way. It's a direct command. Go into all the world and preach the gospel and look at the birds. Now, when you look at them, hey, look at that bird. That's not what he's talking about. They sow not, neither do they reap. Is there any way you could talk about your children about that? Now you got teenagers. Maybe they're preteens, and they're able to pick up that little smartphone. Ask them to Google how many birds there are. $7 billion people. You want the Google answer? I got two of them. You want the big one or the little one? The answer is nobody knows. 7 billion people, 400 billion birds. The big number, I bet you thought that was a big one. The big number is 800 billion birds, and half of them die every year. Could you say, how'd you like to have the responsibility of feeding all of these birds? And then I would say to them, I'll tell you something you've never seen. You've never seen a skinny bird. You got a bird at home in the cage and you forgot to buy bird seed. How would you like to be the one responsible for buying the bird seed for 400 billion birds? That's talking about it, isn't it? The heavens declare the glory of God. Is there any way you could talk to your children about that? And I'm not talking about trying to take the Bible, and ramming it down their throats. I'm just talking about the beauty of it. And when they get in there, and they're in the third or fourth grade, when you begin learning a little bit about astronomy and all of these things, you learn about the Hubble telescope and the Webb telescope and all these other things that are out there, and they are overwhelmed by all of that. The one thing that is missing is God. And that generation that came out of Egypt, you know how many books of the Bible they had when they entered into the promised land? Well, when they got to Mount Sinai, do you know how many chapters of the Bible they had? 2,500 years of Bible history had transpired. How many books of the Bible did they have? They had 0, but the heavens still declared the glory of God. That's why you have a sun god, a moon god, a Saturn god. And that little girl who was out walking with her dad said, "Dad, heaven must really, really be beautiful. It's nighttime. She's looking up at the stars." Somebody had taught that little girl. You know what she said? If the bottom side of heaven is this pretty, how beautiful heaven must be. Isn't that amazing? And we do a reasonably good job, but sometimes we don't really teach the Bible in the way that it really will profit even young children. I think children ought to know the books of the Bible, don't you? I think they ought to be able to quote a lot of books of the Bible, don't you? I think they need to know Jesus was born in Bethlehem, and he was 12 years of age, and when he's 30 years of age, and he was baptized, and he taught all of these parables. I'm glad nobody I know can list all 31 of the parables Jesus, or miracles that Jesus did. You stop and think about it. But there's another aspect of that. It's found in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 20. It says, when your son says to you, what is the meaning of these things? That's not the factual part of it. And he specifically focuses in on the Sabbath commandment when he makes the application of it. When your son comes along and says, why are we doing what we're doing on the Sabbath day? What is the meaning? I know what we do. I know the rules. I know we cannot work. I know that we cannot, we cannot do physical toil. I understand all of that. But the son is not asking, where did the Sabbath come from? He knew about the Sabbath. Somebody had taught that son the facts about the gospel, but he says, What is the meaning of these things? Isn't that amazing? You teach them the Sabbath is Saturday. You teach that in that day you're not to do any work. You teach them in that day you're not to build any fires. You teach them that is a holy day. And the way you keep the Sabbath holy was not to go down to synagogue. Synagogue worship is almost unknown in the Old Testament. It actually is unknown. It came about when the Jews were scattered all over. It became a part of Jewish tradition during the time between the end of the Old Testament and the starting of the New Testament. There was not a Saturday assembly. The Jews did not go to church on Saturday. You know what they did? Remember the rest day. Dad, we've been working hard and we're sitting around resting today. Why are we doing this? What's the meaning of it? And then you tell them the meaning of it. What's the meaning of this table? Oh, we do it every first day of the week. Acts chapter 20, verse 7. I'm glad you know that. I'm thankful that I know it. I'm glad someone taught me Acts chapter 20, verse 7. That's not the meaning of it. What's the meaning of this table? We do it every week. Why? That's because they did it every week, and we want to be like that New Testament church was. That's a little bit about why we do it, want to be like that New Testament church. And we use fruit of the vine, and we use unleavened bread. And so they get all about the Lord's Supper, except what about the meaning of it? And so that comes to the part of teaching your children by what you do that they silently see. When they watch you eat the Lord's Supper, what do they see? Got the bread? Where's my phone? Oh, my phone just buzzed. I eat the bread, phone just buzzed. What time's the Falcons game start? I believe I'll just check that. Who won that football game last night? I'm eating their bread. And I drink the cup. And I think my children grow up seeing me eating the bread and drinking the cup every Sunday. They understand it. They understand the facts of it. They understand what we do. But they're seeing far more than that. Two men eating the Lord's Supper. They do exactly the same thing. One eats the bread, the other eats the bread. One drinks the cup, and the other drinks the cup. This one discerns the Lord's body, and this other one is eating and drinking damnation unto himself. And that child sees it. What's the meaning of this baptismal pool? The most excited your children ought to ever be, your grandchildren ought to ever be, is when there's a baptism. Look at that. You know what just happened? Every sin, every wrong that ever done was washed away, and God doesn't remember. Oh, we know. You got to bury them in water. Make sure you get them buried fully underwater. And I am not mocking teaching the facts. If you knew my process of teaching, and you folks grew up at Palm Beach Lakes, I teach tons and tons of facts. But if we never get to that next level, why do we read the Bible? What do our children see? And I want you to think about your grandmother's Bible. She didn't have television. How many marks were there in it? That's what I'm talking about. I preached in Birmingham, Alabama for 10 years. I've been 40 years down in West Palm, 10 years in New Zealand, 10 years in Birmingham, 40 years in West Palm. It's remarkable. Aunt Annie loved her to pieces. She and Uncle Jim sat right there, one row behind you two. Every time I'd start quoting a verse, I could look at her and she'd be mouthing the verse. She'd be quoting the verse with me. You've had some Aunt Annies in your life, haven't you? And I was talking to Aunt Annie, and I said, Aunt Annie, how did you learn the Bible? And she said, I was 50 years of age before I was baptized. I grew up in a church where they had sprinkling, but I knew as soon as I found out you had to be immersed, I left. And that's when I really started studying the Bible. Well, Aunt Annie, how do you know it so much? You ready for this one? I spilled a lot of bean juice on it. We got bean juice. I'm cooking dinner. Got a pot of beans. And I spilled bean juice. That's what I'm talking about. One final thing. In Exodus, I forgot what chapter it is. I've got it here in my notes. I could look down and I could guess at it, and you wouldn't know whether I was guessing right or wrong, so I'm not going to even guess. As Brother Keeble would say, just read the whole book. It's in there. That first animal that was born belonged to God. And God tells these fathers who are to teach these things diligently unto your children when you're walking by the way. He got this donkey. Little donkey's been born. Belongs to God. Now he can keep it. It's his donkey. He owned the mother and the father of that donkey. That's his donkey, except it's the firstborn, and it belonged to God. And the only way he could keep that donkey was to pay money into the Jewish treasury to redeem that donkey. It wasn't a lot. And then he says, but if you choose not to keep the donkey, put your foot on its neck and break its neck. You want to be a Jewish boy? And you see that. That's when you're walking by the way. The firstborn belongs to God. And Israel is my firstborn, and you are an Israelite, and you belong to God. You teach your children. When they leave on that date, you need to always say to them, remember who you are and what you are. I'm redeemed. That's not a song. And our children watching us sing songs like that will learn more by what we do and how we do it than they will otherwise. Well, that's the introduction of this lesson, and it's 10:15, and it's a stopping place. Next hour, we're going to talk some more, go in a totally different direction. But we need to understand, if we don't teach our children, the world is. And the God of this world is doing all he can to take your children and your grandchildren to hell. And they'll know more about movie stars than about biblical heroes. God help us to raise godly children. Thank you very much.